Today, we're going to explore the secrets of Nazi Germany that you have almost certainly never heard of before. The darkest Nazi project. As the Nuremberg trials drew to a close, the world believed that all those responsible for the most horrific crimes of Nazi Germany would be brought to justice. Generals, commanders, and the very architects of the fascist machine all took their turns before the court. But among the long list of those put on trial, the name Hans Kammler was nowhere to be found. His absence left many people questioning the true fate of one of the most powerful and ruthless figures in Hitler's regime. Hans Kammler had played a central role in the Nazis' secret weapons programs and was notorious for constructing complex underground tunnel systems. These tunnels were not only used to hide vast stores of weaponry, but they also served as hidden sites for advanced research and testing on some of the era's most cutting-edge weapons. Records show that Kammler oversaw projects so dangerous and enigmatic that even Winston Churchill wished to keep them hidden from the world. In the final days of World War II, rumors began to circulate about one last project that Kammler was pouring all his resources and intellect into completing. It was a device shaped like a bell, known simply as Die Glocke. Witnesses described how this machine emitted a strange light and radiated an energy so deadly it could kill within minutes of exposure. Some reports even claimed that Die Glocke possessed qualities that modern science still cannot explain. This, it seemed, was Kammler's last bargaining chip as the world around him crumbled. But when the war ended, Hans Kammler vanished completely, taking the secret of Die Glocke with him. No one ever found a body, nor any evidence to prove he had died or been captured. Rumors quickly multiplied. Some believed Kammler had succeeded in creating this bizarre weapon and was spirited away by some unknown power. Even today, the real fate of Hans Kammler and the secrets he carried remain one of the greatest unresolved mysteries of World War II. The story goes back to 1933, the moment when Adolf Hitler had just been appointed Chancellor of Germany and began step by step to establish absolute power across the nation. This event marked the beginning of a dark era, where extreme ideas and radical nationalism were legitimized by law and violence. That same year, Germany's first concentration camp was established at Dachau under the command of Heinrich Himmler. Initially, it was declared to be a detention center for political dissidents, but in a short time, the range of those imprisoned expanded rapidly. Not only political activists, but Jews, Romani people, clergy, foreigners, and anyone who disagreed with the new regime became victims of the state. Along with the development of the concentration camp system, Hitler's ruling apparatus began to attract and employ a new generation of state workers. These were engineers, managers, and men with practical minds. They saw cruelty not just as a tool for oppression, but as a means to achieve efficiency and technical progress. Among them, Hans Kammler began to stand out as a construction engineer with both ability and unwavering loyalty to the ideals of the Nazi Party. Kammler did not just work in technical fields. He quickly adapted to the new environment, where power was built on fear and iron discipline. He gradually became one of Hitler's most trusted right-hand men, playing a central role in developing the infrastructure needed for the regime's plans of expansion and social control. From a construction engineer, Kammler became an important part of the Nazi power structure, helping to create a system in which ruthlessness and efficiency always went hand in hand. Hans Kammler was born in 1901 and grew up in a Germany shaken by turmoil after World War I. He was too young to see combat during the war, but later he found his own path to ambition and power. Kammler joined the SS and quickly became a specialist in the SS Race and Settlement Office, where he directly took part in building and enforcing the most brutal racial policies of the Nazi regime. Under Kammler's leadership, strict rules about pure Aryan bloodlines were enforced within the SS. Anyone wishing to become a full member or even to marry someone within the SS had to prove both their own and their wife's ancestry going back to the year 1800. Kammler was not simply following orders, he was openly proud of these extreme controls. He saw them as the only way to protect and maintain the purity of the German people. For Kammler, there were no boundaries of morality or compassion. He believed that human suffering was just a price to be paid for the success of the Thousand-Year Reich that Hitler and the Nazi leaders so often spoke about. That coldness and rigidity made Kammler the very model of the type of person the Nazi machine was always searching for, absolutely loyal and willing to apply any measure in service of the party's ideals. After Hitler launched the invasion of Poland, the Nazi war machine entered a new phase, one driven by the ambition for total control and the systematic destruction of communities deemed undesirable. At this time, Hans Kammler was tasked with expanding the concentration camp model, beginning with the construction of Majdanek in the city of Lublin, Poland. Majdanek was not simply a detention camp. It was designed as a core part of Operation Reinhard, the plan for mass extermination in the newly occupied Eastern territories. The terrible efficiency of Majdanek convinced Kammler that this model needed to be replicated even further. He was the one who planned and pushed for the building of Auschwitz, a complex larger and more elaborate than any camp before it. Under Kammler's direction, Auschwitz quickly became a symbol of destruction, with countless subcamps, gas chambers, and crematoria running without pause. More than 1.1 million people were killed there, the vast majority of them Jews, along with many other victims from across Europe. Thanks to Kammler's decisiveness and ruthlessness, the concentration camps operated smoothly, like true engines of annihilation. He oversaw every stage, from construction and organization to daily management, making sure that every Nazi objective was carried out to the fullest extent. Under Kammler's hand, these camps were not just places of imprisonment, they became machines of genocide. After becoming the architect of the concentration camp system, Hans Kammler was entrusted with even greater responsibilities in the military field. He did not stop at organizing and running the camps. He also personally led some of the Nazis' most secret weapons projects. Kammler was the driving force behind the development of the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. This aircraft had speed and power far beyond any Allied fighter at the time. The engineers under Kammler worked tirelessly to perfect the design, test it, and put the Me-262 into mass production, despite shortages of resources and interference from other high-ranking officials. Kammler's reach did not stop at the skies. He also led the development of the V-2 rocket, the world's first supersonic weapon. The V-2 could fly to the edge of space and then plunge down with tremendous speed, carrying a 1-ton warhead. Its destructive power was so great that Winston Churchill ordered the truth to be kept from the British public, hoping to avoid panic and a collapse of morale. Although these advanced weapons came into use only as the tide of war was already turning against Germany, they were still able to spread terror and devastation until the final days of the Third Reich. Under Kammler's leadership, the Nazis had in their grasp technologies far ahead of their time, but in the end, it was all a desperate last effort by a regime on the brink of collapse. Of all the secret projects Hans Kammler ever directed, Die Glocke, also known as The Bell, was the one that pushed the line between reality and legend to its absolute limit. According to documents leaked after the war, Die Glocke was a device shaped like a giant bell, roughly 4 meters tall and 3 meters wide, with 2 counter-rotating shafts inside. These shafts contained a mysterious violet-colored metallic liquid known as Serum 525. When activated, the device gave off a blinding blue light and released powerful radiation, making the test site lethally dangerous after just a few minutes of exposure. Some who worked on the project later recalled that Die Glocke was not simply a weapon. Many theories suggested the device could create anti-gravity effects, distort the fabric of space, or even affect the flow of time itself. Because of the extreme secrecy, dozens of engineers and scientists involved in the project were executed by the SS to protect its secrets until the very last moment. Many survivors from the Gross-Rosen camp later spoke about the long nights when they saw strange lights coming from the test area and witnessed firsthand as fellow prisoners wasted away from radiation exposure. To this day, the truth about Die Glocke remains a subject of fierce debate. Some believe it was nothing more than a product of post-war imagination, while others are convinced that Kammler truly staked his fate, and that of the entire Reich, on a project that went far beyond anything science could comprehend at the time. For many, Die Glocke stands as proof of the desperate madness that overtook the Nazi regime in its final days. They believed only a miracle of that kind could save a regime teetering on the edge of collapse. As the war entered its most brutal phase, Germany was gripped by severe shortages of supplies, raw materials, and manpower. To keep the secret weapons programs running, Hans Kammler resorted to the harshest solution. He relied on forced labor from thousands of prisoners in the concentration camps. One of the most infamous sites for this model was Mittelbau Dora, near the city of Nordhausen. Here, prisoners were sent down to work in the Kohnstein tunnel system, a dark, stifling labyrinth deep underground. These prisoners not only worked around the clock, but they were also forced to live in those same tunnels. They dug passageways, transported equipment, and assembled components, and every one of them knew that the slightest exhaustion or mistake could mean instant replacement. Many perished from sheer overwork or were left behind when they could no longer keep up. It was in these tunnels that Kammler turned Kohnstein into the largest V2 rocket production center in Nazi Germany, with output reaching as high as 400 rockets a month. The working conditions were so harsh that even high-ranking officers shuddered when they visited. Yet Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and Munitions, could not hide his admiration. He once praised Kammler for turning the place into a factory unmatched in all of Europe, regardless of the thousands of prisoner lives that were sacrificed to make it happen. As the war entered its final years, Allied bombs rained down relentlessly on Germany's major cities. To protect his strategic projects, Hans Kammler pushed forward with building deep underground facilities. The most notable of these was Project Reese, or the Giant Project. This was a vast network of underground tunnels running through the Owl Mountains and stretching all the way beneath Książ Castle in the Silesia region of Poland. More than 13,000 prisoners from concentration camps were forced into the construction of these works. Of that number, at least 5,000 never returned. Their lives ended among the cold concrete and deep stone of the mountains. When asked about such heavy casualties, Kammler simply replied, "Don't worry about the victims. The work must be finished as quickly as possible." That statement alone reveals something of his chilling indifference to human life. Kammler personally oversaw each phase of the project, from tunneling and reinforcing stone walls to building vast underground chambers. Many believe the goal of Project Reese was to create a secret headquarters for Hitler and his top commanders, or perhaps an underground weapons factory to prepare for the war's last stage. However, when the Red Army advanced from the east, the entire project was abandoned. To this day, the true purpose of Project Reese remains a major mystery. No one knows exactly what those deep chambers beneath the Owl Mountains were meant for, or what may have happened behind those cold stone walls. Questions about the true ambitions of Kammler and the Nazi regime continue to fascinate historians around the world. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory in 1945, all eyes turned toward the top leaders of the Nazi regime. Hans Kammler, central to both the weapons programs and the concentration camp system, quickly became a top target for Britain's Special Operations Executive under Operation Little Fox Leader 1. For Allied intelligence, capturing Kammler promised to unlock explosive secrets about Germany's network of secret weapons and underground projects. Yet, Kammler proved to be an extremely elusive adversary. In the last days of the war, he rapidly organized the evacuation of around 500 rocket engineers, the keepers of the most important V2 secrets. At the same time, he ordered the destruction of numerous pieces of equipment and confidential documents to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. To avoid detection, Kammler constantly changed his location, moving from place to place with remarkable speed. Allied radio intelligence continued to pick up signals indicating that Kammler was always on the move during this time. On May 4, 1945, Kammler suddenly handed a sealed letter to his most trusted assistant, then disappeared near the city of Linz, Austria. That was the last clear sighting of him. 3 days later, on May 7th, just 1 day before Germany's official surrender, the final Allied signal intercepts lost track of Kammler altogether. No one knew exactly where he had gone. This mysterious disappearance has become one of the most strange and confounding stories of the Second World War. From the moment Hans Kammler vanished, no one has been able to determine his true fate. The story of Kammler's final days quickly became the subject of countless theories, each one raising more questions than answers. Some believe he was killed while trying to escape and was hastily buried in a secret location. Others think Kammler took his own life once he realized there was no escape from the Allied encirclement. Yet, one of the most famous theories claims Kammler managed to swap identities with his loyal driver and disappear without a trace. Even when Baum's grave was exhumed years after the war, no remains were ever found inside. deepening the mystery even further. There are also reports suggesting that Kammler was actually captured by the US military on May 9, 1945, just one day after Germany's surrender. However, instead of facing trial, Kammler once again vanished from American custody. Some believe he was taken to the United States and lived in secrecy under a new identity in exchange for the scientific, technical, and weapons secrets he possessed. For many, Kammler's disappearance is not just a personal story, but a crucial link in the larger chain of mysteries about how the victorious nations handled Nazi war criminals and intellectual property after the war. Secret Nazi werewolves sent to hunt Allied soldiers. As Allied forces closed in on each city and the sounds of bombs and gunfire echoed without pause, the leaders of the Nazi Party understood that the days of their regime were numbered, and the end was now a matter of hours. Yet instead of facing this harsh reality and surrendering to save the lives of millions of innocent civilians, they issued one final order, an order marked by extremism and desperation. This command was broadcast across the country, calling on every German citizen to stand their ground, never retreat, fight to the very last breath, and be willing to sacrifice everything, if necessary, to defend the ideals they had believed in. The true purpose of this order was not to reverse the course of the war or reclaim victory for Germany, but rather to sow fear into the hearts of the advancing Allied soldiers, those who were about to take control of Germany after years of relentless war. It was out of this atmosphere of chaos and despair that the werewolf force was born, a last desperate gamble by the Nazi Party. This was not a conventional army, but rather a group of specially selected and trained individuals tasked with carrying out acts of guerrilla warfare, terror, and assassination against Allied troops in the occupied areas. They operated in secret, moving through the shadows, striking without warning, and vanishing quickly after each attack. Their only goal was to spread confusion, to create a lasting sense of dread for both the Allied soldiers and the German population. Even after the war had officially ended, the werewolves continued their sabotage, carrying out sporadic attacks and assassinations against those they considered traitors to the national cause. For many ordinary Germans at the time, the appearance of this force did not merely prolong the agony of war, it deepened the fear and division that already ran through every corner of the country. The deeper origins of the werewolf force did not simply arise from political calculations. They were also fueled by the legends and folklore woven throughout German culture itself. From the earliest days of his rise to power, Adolf Hitler displayed a particular fascination with mysterious symbols, especially those drawn from supernatural figures tied to the land. Among these, the image of the werewolf, or Werwolf as the Germans called it, held a special allure, thanks to its air of mystery and the extraordinary abilities it represented. This image was only strengthened by the famous novel Der Werwolf by Hermann Lohns, published in 1910, which told the story of an ordinary community forced to defend itself, transforming into brutal warriors who, despite their savagery, were celebrated as heroes for protecting their own people. For Hitler and the propaganda machinery of the Nazi Party, the werewolf was more than just a creature of the night. It became a symbol of indomitable strength and the unyielding spirit of the nation. In their eyes, ordinary citizens who stood up against their enemies would become like werewolf warriors, willing to do whatever it took to resist invaders and preserve their national identity. For this reason, the werewolf became a source of spiritual motivation, spreading messages of courage, sacrifice, and the belief that Germany had not truly fallen. As the situation grew ever more desperate and the choices narrowed, the Nazi leadership decided to turn the werewolf symbol into an actual strategy. This plan unfolded along two distinct paths. On one side, they launched a formal military campaign with regular organized units. On the other, they formed semi-armed guerrilla groups designed to operate independently, flexibly, and beyond easy control. The common goal was to maintain resistance in any form, from open battlefield engagements to sudden, unexpected attacks from behind enemy lines. At the end of 1944, Heinrich Himmler officially launched Operation Werwolf. He appointed Hans Adolf Pritzmann as Chief Inspector of Special Defense, assigning him the task of forming combat groups to operate secretly behind Allied lines. This force was mainly recruited from members of the SS and the Hitler Youth. These groups received special training in guerrilla tactics, assassination, and covert operations, preparing them to act independently whenever the time came. After being given the responsibility of organizing the werewolf force, Hans Adolf Prützmann quickly set up his headquarters in Berlin. Realizing that the nature of the war had changed and the Allies were advancing from all directions, Prützmann spent much of his time studying the guerrilla tactics used by the Soviet Red Army in Ukraine. He hoped to apply these lessons to build a resistance force that could survive and operate effectively, even if the machinery of the Nazi state collapsed. Prützmann's original plan was not to create a large-scale uprising, but rather to use the werewolves as a tool to slow the Allied advance. He believed that if these small groups could launch surprise attacks, Germany might be able to prolong its resistance and gain a better position during peace negotiations. However, what the werewolf force actually accomplished was not on the battlefield, but mainly in terms of psychological impact. Their presence forced the Allies to remain constantly alert and live in a state of unease, but in reality, they did not produce any significant change in the overall course of the war. Within the ranks of the Nazi government itself, not everyone trusted Prützmann or the strategy he was pursuing. Many believed he lacked decisiveness and did not have the stature to lead such a critical campaign. Notably, Walter Schellenberg, the head of Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service, openly criticized the entire werewolf plan, calling it criminal and foolish. He argued that placing the nation's future in the hands of a semi-armed underground group would only increase chaos without bringing any real results. In the end, efforts to build the werewolf force were themselves undermined by the weaknesses of the Nazi administrative system and the collapse of its organizational structure. The force faced severe shortages of equipment, weapons, food, and qualified manpower. Independent groups could not coordinate with each other, and orders from above were often interrupted or failed to reach the right people, causing the entire strategy to fall apart quickly. In reality, the werewolf force never became a true threat. They stood only as a symbol of desperation and helplessness in the final days of the Third Reich. By 1945, as the outcome of the war was all but decided and any hope for a Nazi victory had nearly vanished, the regime's propaganda machine was pushed to its most extreme. Joseph Goebbels, the infamous minister of propaganda, understood that if the situation could no longer be salvaged by military might, there was still power in words. Goebbels appeared continuously on national radio, launching a massive propaganda campaign that called on every German citizen to rise up and join the werewolf force. In his famous werewolf speech, broadcast on March 23, 1945, he urged the entire nation to fight to the bitter end, never to surrender or back down, insisting that every person could become a warrior to defend Germany against the invaders. Even though, in reality, the werewolf force was neither large nor well-equipped, the small-scale attacks and acts of sabotage they carried out had a profound psychological effect on the Allied troops. Just a few explosions, sudden ambushes, or even rumors of guerrilla groups operating in the shadows were enough to keep American and British soldiers in a constant state of vigilance. For them, the atmosphere of unease and the fear of an unseen enemy became part of everyday life during those final months in Germany. However, German society at this time was far different from what the propaganda machine described. After years of relentless war, most people were exhausted, physically and mentally. They no longer cared for the ideal of fighting to the death. Instead, all they wanted was peace, to save their families from hunger and ruin. The rallying cries on the radio now echoed through an atmosphere of gloom, as few still had the faith or strength to answer the call. Even so, a handful of small groups continued to carry out assassinations against those considered traitors. One of the most notable incidents was the killing of Frank Oppenhoff, the mayor of Aachen, who had cooperated with the Allies and became a target of the werewolf commandos. His death sent a wave of anxiety not only through the new authorities, but also throughout the German community at large. At the same time, newspapers in both Germany and abroad published a steady stream of stories, often exaggerating the danger posed by the werewolf force, further fueling an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. For both ordinary Germans and the Allied soldiers, the harsh realities of war had barely faded when they were haunted by this new shadow of terror and distrust, making the final days of the Third Reich even heavier and darker. When the war officially ended in May 1945, the specter of the werewolf still lingered across Germany and among the occupying Allied forces. fear of hidden resistance groups operating in the shadows led the Allies to impose strict controls on the German population. They increased inspections, restricted freedom of movement, and enforced harsh regulations on anyone suspected of being involved in resistance activities. For many Germans, the post-war period was not only a time of poverty and loss, but also an era marked by constant suspicion and fear, where even a baseless accusation could bring about serious consequences. When a fake Nazi commander took over a Canadian town. In the early 1940s, as World War II erupted across continents and no nation remained untouched by the chaos, Canada joined the conflict in 1939. Within just a few years, every aspect of Canadian society was transformed as factories, neighborhoods, and families all rallied around a single purpose, contributing to the Allied victory. Each day, Canadian families sent their sons and daughters to the front lines, while back home, those who stayed behind worked tirelessly, producing weapons, uniforms, medicine, and every essential supply needed for the brutal war raging overseas. Even so, the determination and enthusiasm of the people gradually began to fade, especially as the war remained a distant threat, and for most Canadians, life continued on in relative peace, almost as if nothing had changed. The government understood that in order to sustain its strength and continue supporting the military, the country would need a tremendous amount of financial resources. That's why they repeatedly called on citizens to purchase victory bonds, hoping that every individual would contribute a small part to fuel the nation's strength. At first, many were eager to participate, believing that these bonds were a guarantee of peace and freedom. But as time went on, that initial enthusiasm faded. People began to question whether their money was truly making a difference, especially as the war was, for most, just an image in the newspaper or a story on the radio. In response to this situation, a bold idea emerged in the city of Winnipeg. John Draper Perrin, the head of the National War Finance Committee, along with the city's leaders, decided to organize an event unlike anything Canada had ever seen. They would stage a fake Nazi invasion right on the familiar streets of Winnipeg to show people that the threat was no longer something distant. It could appear anywhere, at any time. They believed that only when faced with the real fear of losing freedom and homeland would people truly understand the value of even the smallest contribution. In this way, they hoped to reignite patriotism, strengthen unity, and inspire everyone to join together in protecting the freedom of the entire nation. When the idea of staging a Nazi invasion was approved, preparations for the event, called If Day, began with a level of detail and care never before seen. The organizers knew that even the smallest mistake could spark real panic among the public or undermine the purpose of the entire campaign. So, they meticulously planned every aspect of that day to be as vivid and convincing as possible, ensuring that anyone who witnessed it would feel this was a scenario that could happen at any moment in real life. To create the most realistic atmosphere, the organizers rented hundreds of authentic Nazi military uniforms from major Hollywood studios. They didn't just choose the uniforms, they paid attention to the smallest details, from insignias and belts to leather boots and those distinctive steel helmets. When these uniforms arrived in Winnipeg, the entire city took on a new air of anxiety and curiosity. The German soldiers themselves were actually members of the Winnipeg Junior Board of Trade, who had rigorously rehearsed to fully inhabit the roles of invading troops. The script for If Day was constructed as tightly as a real military operation. The Nazi forces were led by familiar names from the city, with Erich von Nuremberg taking on the role of commander-in-chief. Alongside them, more than 3,500 people, including regular Canadian soldiers, reservists, and volunteers, took part in defending the city. They represented renowned units like the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, the 5th Field Regiment, Royal Winnipeg Rifles, Winnipeg Grenadiers, and several other reserve forces. To make sure the event went smoothly and didn't trigger unintended panic, city authorities coordinated with radio stations and newspapers to notify the public in advance. Warnings were sent out to surrounding areas, even as far as Minnesota across the US border. Thanks to these efforts, as If Day approached, Winnipeg's residents felt a mix of anticipation and readiness to witness a day unlike anything the city had ever seen. On the early morning of February 19, 1942, Winnipeg awoke to the blaring sound of emergency sirens. Across every street, people stood silent at their windows, listening to the long, shrill wail that signaled something unprecedented in the city's history. In that moment, war no longer felt like a distant story. It had suddenly become a reality right outside their doors. At exactly 7 o'clock, those playing the role of Nazi soldiers began storming the city's major radio stations. They quickly detained the announcers, took control of the airwaves, and broadcast the first orders of the new government. Meanwhile, Canadian military units coordinated to organize the city's defense. Tanks and anti-aircraft guns were positioned at key intersections, creating an atmosphere of tension and suffocation throughout Winnipeg. The exercise didn't stop at staged maneuvers. Real explosives were used to destroy bridges and vital infrastructure, making the battlefield feel alive down to the smallest detail. Volunteers playing the wounded lay scattered across the streets to capture the true pain of war. The sound of fake gunfire and thunderous blasts, mixed with the chaos of shouting and alarms, sent shivers down the spines of those who witnessed scenes that seemed to have leapt straight out of a movie. By around 9:30 in the morning, after hours of fierce resistance, the Canadian defenders surrendered to the enemy. In that moment, the city of Winnipeg officially fell into the hands of the Nazis. The national flag was lowered, the Nazi swastika raised, and the city was immediately renamed Himmlerstadt, after Heinrich Himmler, the infamous leader of the Nazi SS. For the people of Winnipeg, everything familiar suddenly vanished, replaced by a heavy and unsettling atmosphere that settled over every corner of the city. Immediately after Winnipeg was occupied, the mood throughout the city changed completely in just a single morning. A new government was established on the spot, with unfamiliar names like Erich von Nuremberg, who played the role of occupation leader, and George Waite, who took on the role of Gestapo chief. Respected figures of the city, such as Premier John Bracken, Mayor John Queen, Governor Roland Fairbairn McWilliams, and even the Norwegian ambassador Wilhelm de Morgenstierne, were all arrested at their workplaces and sent to makeshift detention camps set up for that day. Canadian money was seized and replaced with counterfeit Reichsmarks, leaving people stunned at how everything they knew had suddenly disappeared. New regulation posters went up on every street corner, publicly announcing curfews, bans on large gatherings, prohibitions on religious practice, and a requirement to buy war bonds under threat of heavy fines. The press was tightly censored, with familiar newspapers like the Winnipeg Tribune abruptly renamed Das Winnipeger Lügenblatt, and every article subject to review by the new authorities. There was even a satirical section where readers were expected to laugh or risk arrest if they did not. Schools were transformed as well, with local teachers replaced by Nazi instructors, and the curriculum focused solely on glorifying the Nazi regime. Old lessons on freedom and democracy were erased, replaced with lessons on German history, war, and loyalty to Führer Hitler. Throughout the city, loudspeakers blared Hitler's speeches and German military music, deepening the atmosphere of oppression. Striking images filled the day. Books burned outside the public library, German soldiers searching homes, confiscating food, coats, and even the smallest personal items. The people of Winnipeg, for the first time, truly felt the fear and helplessness that comes when all freedoms are stripped away. They realized that if the war were lost, the free and peaceful life they once enjoyed would be gone forever. And that day made this fear a vivid reality on their own doorstep. As evening fell, If Day drew to a close, leaving Winnipeg with a sense of both relief and somber reflection. The honorary prisoners were released one by one in front of crowds of citizens. Soon after, the streets echoed with calls for unity and speeches from politicians, all emphasizing the value of freedom and the responsibility each person bears for the nation's future. The next day, Winnipeg gradually returned to normal. The Nazi flags were taken down, signs and pamphlets bearing Nazi symbols were cleaned up, and every trace of that terrifying day quickly vanished from the city's streets. Yet the memory of fear remained, lingering in the minds of all who had experienced this unprecedented event. They understood now that freedom and peace are not things to be taken for granted, but are the result of unity and the contribution of each individual. For that reason, If Day became a turning point, igniting an unprecedented surge in the Victory Bond campaign across Manitoba. In a short time, the funds raised surpassed all expectations, over $47 million, far exceeding the goal of $45 million, an amount that would be nearly $700 million today. What was truly remarkable was not just the financial contributions, but also the heightened sense of responsibility and patriotism among the people. Many young volunteers who had played the role of German soldiers that day later enlisted for real, such as George Hoffman, who just 2 months after If Day left home for Europe to fight for freedom in earnest. The secret Nazi fighter jet you've never heard of. In 1944, the atmosphere of war across Europe had changed clearly, and for Germany, the days of glory on the battlefield had truly become a thing of the past. After 3 years of conquering many territories and spreading fear across the continent, the German army began to face a cold reality. Vital resources for war like oil, steel, and aluminum had been steadily depleted with each long and drawn-out battle. This shortage did not only weaken the army's fighting strength, but it also caused factories and workshops inside Germany to fall into a state of growing stagnation. At this point, what had once been Germany's absolute advantage now became a burden that could not be overcome. The relentless attacks from the Allies made every front that Germany controlled slowly shrink, and losing the initiative forced the German military leadership to change their strategy. They realized they could not keep producing bombers or big aircraft as before. Instead, they had to gather every remaining resource to develop advanced jet fighter models, holding on to a faint hope that a leap in technology could turn the tide of war. But what the Germans did not expect was the rapid progress of military technology from the Allies. If in the past, the German Air Force was proud to own the most advanced aviation technology in the world, by 1944, this advantage was starting to fade. Researchers and engineers from Britain and America not only closed the gap, but kept coming up with new inventions that could change the entire balance in the skies over Europe. Especially when news broke that the British were about to introduce the Gloucester Meteor, the Allies' first jet fighter, the worry and pressure inside the German Air Force reached its peak. The atmosphere inside the German high command meetings became more tense than ever. High-ranking officers had to admit that the days when Germany could impose its will across Europe through military strength and technological superiority were over. From this point, every decision came with the fear of failure and a growing sense of despair. In that situation, the race for technology became Germany's last gamble, but they knew that every choice now carried many risks, and there was nothing to guarantee that a true miracle would appear. In an increasingly desperate situation, the generals of the Luftwaffe understood that if they wanted to hold on to any hope in the skies over Europe, they needed a new kind of weapon that could truly change the course of the war. Their experience with the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first jet fighter, had given Germany some optimism about what their technology could achieve. However, the harsh reality of war showed that the Me 262 was not enough to create the turning point that Germany so badly needed. The reason was not just because production numbers were far too low, but also because every single plane required precious resources that Germany had almost completely run out of. It was in this context that a new project, known as the Focke-Wulf Ta 183 Huckebein, began to take shape and quickly attracted a lot of hope. Germany's leading designers and engineers spent many months researching, drawing plans, and testing prototypes, hoping to create a brand new jet fighter that could replace the Me 262 and bring back an advantage for the German Air Force. To get the Ta-183 ready for the battlefield, the engineers were forced to accept any solution, even the most unconventional. At times, shortages of aluminum, steel, and other essential materials meant the design team even had to consider using wood for important parts of the plane. This did not only show their desperation, but also their determination not to give up, holding on to the belief that a breakthrough in technology might still come at the last moment. Even though building a fighter out of wood meant taking many risks, for Germany at that time, it was the only hope they had left. The highlight of the Ta-183 was its modern appearance and the series of advanced technical improvements that the design team introduced. Instead of following traditional lines, this plane had a large air intake right at the front of the nose, helping the jet engine in the rear to work more efficiently. The sharply swept back wings, angled a full 40 degrees, not only brought high flight performance, but also gave the plane better agility to dodge attacks from enemy fighters. The tricycle landing gear allowed for stable takeoffs and landings, while the tall T-shaped tail and the centrally positioned bubble canopy gave the pilot a wide field of view, something absolutely critical in the fast-paced air battles of the time. The Ta-183 was powered by the strong Heinkel He S011 engine with a top speed of up to 620 miles per hour, which was much faster than the Me-262. In terms of firepower, this aircraft carried four 30mm Mk108 cannons, mounted straight in the nose, powerful enough to shoot down both heavy bombers and enemy fighters. On top of that, the Ta-183 could also carry up to 1,000 pounds of external weapons, ready to take on ground attack missions whenever needed. At the beginning of 1945, the Ta-183 project from Focke-Wulf was already very close to the finish line. The detailed design plans had been completed, and the team of engineers was only focused on solving a few technical problems related to the aircraft's center of gravity. However, just as it seemed all their efforts were about to bear fruit, the course of the war changed too quickly, presenting challenges that even the most dedicated designers could not control. On February 28, 1945, the German Air Force Command faced a difficult decision. They had to choose which project would be pushed into mass production during the short time they had left. After much debate, the Luftwaffe decided to give top priority on the production line to the Junkers EF-128, while the Ta-183 was placed in second position. But that was not the end of the story. In a sudden turn, when the German military leaders saw the special potential of the Ta-183, they reversed their decision and gave this plane one last chance. If everything went according to plan, the first flight of the Ta-183 was expected to happen in May 1945. But the war did not give them any more chances. While the Focke-Wulf engineers were still racing to complete the first prototype, the Allied forces were closing in on Berlin from every direction. In a very short time, the situation on the battlefield changed completely. On April 8, 1945, British troops entered and took control of the entire Focke-Wulf factory. All of the efforts, design documents, test models, and hopes for a final miracle in German military aviation were cut off before they ever took shape. The Ta-183 project officially ended unfinished. Even so, the ideas and technology that the engineering team left behind for the Ta-183 still became an important inspiration for the world's military aviation industry later on. Even though the fate of the Ta-183 in Germany ended in silence and regret, the story of this plane unexpectedly began a new chapter in South America. After World War II ended, engineer Kurt Tank, the head of the Ta-183 project, left Europe and looked for opportunities in Argentina, where the government was eager to modernize its air force. Not willing to let his efforts and knowledge fade away, Kurt Tank decided to revive the Ta-183 design under a completely new name, Focke-Wulf Ta. In the early 1950s, several prototypes of the Focke-Wulf Ta were built one after another. These planes not only carried the shape of the Ta-183, but also represented Argentina's desire to be independent in technology. The Focke-Wulf Ta even appeared in the skies during the 1955 coup, a dramatic event in the country's political history. But the dream of a fully homegrown jet fighter in Argentina did not last long. When the economy went into crisis, the entire Focke-Wulf Ta project was forced to stop, and eventually, the Argentine government chose a more practical solution by importing F-86 Sabre fighters from the United States at a much lower cost. But the story did not end there. The legacy of the Ta-183 continued to stir up debate and speculation among military aviation researchers worldwide. Many historians believe that after the war, some of the design plans and documents related to the Ta 183 fell into Soviet hands. From this material, Soviet engineers may have taken inspiration to develop the MiG-15, a jet fighter that would become one of the most famous planes of the Cold War era. It is not hard to notice the striking similarities between these two aircraft, from the distinctive high tail to the air intake in the front of the nose. Although the direct link between the Ta 183 and the MiG-15 is still a subject of debate, it is clear that the creative spirit and influence of the Ta 183 went far beyond the borders of Germany, becoming an essential part of the history of modern jet aircraft all over the world. Hitler's most evil personal bodyguards. In the early days, when the Nazi Party was still young and had not truly gained its position on the German political stage, Adolf Hitler already understood very clearly that if he wanted to go further on the road to power, he needed to have a group of people who were truly loyal, people who were not only ready to protect him, but also willing to sacrifice for the ideals he represented. During his first speeches, Hitler was protected by some close allies like Ernst Röhm, along with Battalion 19, and it was they who formed the first models for Hitler's bodyguard force. These people did not just stand behind to block any danger, but also served as silent witnesses to the rise of a new movement in Germany. As the need for protection became more urgent, this initial group of bodyguards quickly developed into a larger organization called the Sturmabteilung, or SA for short. This was no longer just a protection squad. It was gradually turning into a main armed force that helped Hitler expand his influence and also served as a shield for Nazi leaders against assassination plots or sabotage by their opponents. Hitler very early recognized that an organization as large as the SA was both a source of strength and a risk of losing control, especially when the loyalty of each individual could not always be guaranteed. That is why he took the initiative to form a smaller group, made up entirely of people who were carefully selected based on absolute loyalty and dedication to serving him personally. This group was called the Stabswash, and they wore the skull symbol called the Totenkopf, showing their willingness to fight to the end and not back down from any danger. This bodyguard team was later renamed the Stostrup Hitler to emphasize their role as Hitler's direct protection and to tie their name directly to his. However, these efforts to build a loyal force faced a major test when the Munich Putsch in 1923 failed, with Hitler himself and many of his associates arrested, the Nazi Party banned, and the Stostrup Hitler unit disbanded. Even so, the SA under the command of Ernst Röhm continued to exist under a new name, the Frontbahn, though it was watched more closely and had to operate more secretly than before. It was through these events that Hitler's determination to build a bodyguard force truly loyal to him personally became even stronger, and it laid the foundation for the creation of special units later on, which would play no small part in the dramatic changes that Germany would go through in the years ahead. When the Munich Putsch failed and many of the top leaders of the Nazi Party were arrested, no one thought the SA could continue to exist, much less grow stronger than ever. From a group of just about 2,000 men, the SA quietly recruited and expanded, quickly turning itself into the most powerful paramilitary organization in Germany at that time, with membership reaching nearly 30,000 people in just a few years. This growth did not only change how the SA operated, but also made their role within the party much bigger, especially in those years when Germany was unstable and street violence and clashes with rival factions happened all the time. When he was released from prison in December 1924, after his time in custody, Adolf Hitler realized that the SA was no longer his simple tool. Hitler saw in the SA a lot of hidden risks, as Ernst Röhm had his own ambitions and often disagreed with Hitler about the direction and future role of the SA in Germany. These simmering tensions dragged on for years until everything exploded violently in what history would call the Night of the Long Knives. On that night, Adolf Hitler took decisive action to eliminate those he saw as threats to his absolute power. Ernst Röhm, along with many SA leaders, was arrested or assassinated, ending the era of SA power and leaving a huge gap in both Hitler's protection system and the structure of his power. It was at this moment that Hitler realized he could no longer trust his personal safety to an organization that was too large, too full of personal ambitions, and too easily turned into a tool for political schemes like the SA. Hitler needed a new force, a group selected solely on the basis of absolute loyalty to him, without concern for personal gain or any other faction. In those circumstances, the Schutzstaffel, known as the SS, was created. At first, the SS was just a small unit that depended on the SA, with the main task of protecting Nazi leaders at rallies, at important events, and keeping control over internal security. But within just a few years, the SS quietly rose up in strength, constantly expanding its influence and becoming a direct competitor to the SA in both power and size. The incredible rise of the SS even caused deep division within the Nazi Party itself. Many people remained loyal to the SA, but more and more talented individuals were personally chosen by Hitler for the SS, thanks to their discipline and dedication. Hitler believed completely that only the SS could truly protect him from every danger, whether it came from outside or from inside the party. By the time Hitler officially took control of Germany, the SS had grown to about 50,000 members, but for Hitler, that still was not enough to safeguard his absolute power, especially since plots and threats never stopped appearing. For that reason, from within the SS, an elite force was established called SS Sonderkommando Berlin, a unit made up of people chosen carefully for their physical strength, willpower, dedication, and complete loyalty to Hitler personally. After a period of operation, this unit was renamed Adolf Hitler Standarte to highlight its direct protective role for Hitler and to make clear that it was the most honored unit, taking orders only from the Führer. Under the command of Heinrich Himmler, whom Hitler completely trusted with power, this unit finally became known as the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, abbreviated as LSSAH, and from that point it was the most feared special bodyguard unit in modern German history. Two companies of the LSSAH, under the command of Otto Reich and Jürgen Wagner, were chosen to deal with threats against the regime, whether they were real dangers or simply suspicions from Hitler and his closest allies. This force took part directly in executing people who were considered traitors or potential risks, which helped solidify the independent position and absolute power of the SS within the Nazi Party's security system. The LSSAH did not stop at protecting the party from within. As the war atmosphere began to spread across Europe, the LSSAH was quickly given much larger missions. The next year, the LSSAH took part in the campaign to occupy the Saarland and was one of the leading units in the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland into Germany in 1945-1938. These were the first steps that brought this force out from the shadows of internal purges, turning them into an extension of Hitler's hand on the international stage. When World War II broke out, the LSSAH was no longer just an elite bodyguard unit. It had been expanded into a large infantry regiment, with many battalions and specialized units like anti-tank, reconnaissance, and engineering. This unit fought in Poland, where they faced skilled cavalry brigades and the tough infantry units of the Polish army. During this campaign, the LSSAH was not only known as a formidable fighting force, but was also accused of many war crimes against civilians in the areas they passed through, leaving a stain that cannot be erased from modern history. After finishing its mission in Poland, the LSSAH was moved to the Western Front to join the campaign against the Low Countries in France. Here, the unit took part in major battles such as Dunkirk, where British and French forces had to retreat in chaos, and at Amiens, where the LSSAH helped change the outcome of the entire campaign. Especially as one of the leading units, they crossed the Seine River and cut off the last escape routes of the French army, speeding up the collapse of France under the strength of Nazi Germany. After France surrendered, the LSSAH stayed in the occupied region to rest and rebuild its strength, getting ready for the invasion of Britain that Hitler was planning. After a series of victories in Western Europe, Hitler placed high hopes on the plan to invade Britain, but in the end, the operation was cancelled for many reasons. From that point on, the LSSAH entered a new phase, facing greater challenges across some of the most brutal battlefields in Europe. No longer in reserve, the unit was quickly sent to Romania, then went on to join large-scale military operations in Yugoslavia and Greece, where the chaos of the battlefield forced the LSSAH to fight, while also working with German troops to rescue Italian forces trapped and retreating under siege. On top of that, they pushed the British Army into a retreat all the way down to the Peloponnesus Peninsula, turning the battles there into a drawn-out chase that lasted for weeks. Success in this campaign allowed the LSSAH to be upgraded to division status. In reality, its manpower was still limited compared to regular divisions, but this marked a turning point, confirming the new role of what had once been only Hitler's special bodyguard unit. That growth was soon put to the test when the LSSAH was sent into the invasion of the Soviet Union, operating under Army Group South, one of the main forces in Operation Barbarossa. There, the unit took part in fierce battles like the assault on the Crimea, breaking through the defenses at Kyiv and racing to capture Rostov before a harsh counterattack from the Red Army. Forced back across the Mias River, the LSSAH suffered heavy casualties and had to withdraw to France to rebuild. However, that period of rest was short-lived because in 1943, the LSSAH was once again sent back to the Eastern Front, where the fighting had grown more intense than ever. The unit was involved in brutal battles at Kharkiv, known especially for bold counterattacks, and then in the Battle of Kursk, one of the largest tank battles in history. But the war did not end there, because immediately after the Soviet campaign, the LSSAH was moved to Italy to deal with guerrilla forces that were active in the mountain regions. After this series of relentless campaigns, the LSSAH was re-equipped and officially became an armored division with much greater mechanized strength, ready to fight wherever Hitler needed. From a guard unit tied to the name of a dictator, the LSSAH had endured many changes to become one of the main fighting forces, present on almost every major European front all the way to the final days of World War II. When the Allies launched the D-Day landings in Normandy, the LSSAH was immediately sent to the most critical battle zones in northern France. The unit fought constantly in places like Caen, Falaise, and Argentan, where bombs and the roar of tanks filled the air for weeks. But against the overwhelming strength and equipment of the Allies, the LSSAH and many other German armored units were soon driven out of France and forced to retreat to defensive positions inside Germany. By the end of 1944, the LSSAH was incorporated into the ISS Panzer Corps and chosen to be a spearhead force in the major battle in the Ardennes, a last-ditch effort by Nazi Germany to try to turn the tide on the Western Front. At first, the LSSAH and its partner units scored some important victories, pushing the Allies back and driving deep into enemy lines. However, as strategic bridges were destroyed, supplies ran short, and Allied planes bombed relentlessly, not allowing the Germans time to regroup. The LSSAH's advance was quickly brought to a halt in the freezing Ardennes forest. The dream of breaking through the Allied lines never came true, and the last hope for a miraculous victory faded away. With no other options, the LSSAH had to withdraw from the Western Front and shift to the east to continue the fight in an ever more desperate situation. The unit joined the final battles with the aim of rescuing German units surrounded in Budapest, but as the situation grew worse, their forces became more depleted and could not change the course of the war. In the end, after months of fighting all the way from the coast of France to the heart of Central Europe, the LSSAH was forced to retreat to Austria when all hope was gone. There, they surrendered to American forces, officially closing the chapter on one of the most loyal and feared bodyguard units ever to stand at Hitler's side throughout World War II. What do you think about these secrets from Nazi Germany? Thank you for taking the time to watch our video. If you found this story interesting, please leave your thoughts in the comments below and share the video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our next fascinating historical mysteries. We'll see you in the next video.